Hello everyone and welcome to Halakha class. Tonight we are going to look at two fundamentals which comes up a lot of the time. One is the kashrut of gelatin and the other one is the kashrut of sherry cask whiskeys. And I've written a blog about this, I've spoken about it, but we're going to go into a little bit more detail tonight to really understand some of the ins and outs of it. But before we go into whiskey, let's really get into gelatin and understand what exactly is going on in it. So I'm going to explain with the introduction here done by Mizrahi, and they explain as follows. Another ingredient sometimes found in certain kinds of candies and dairy products that could raise potential kashrut questions is gelatin. Gelatin is usually produced from either the bones or skin of cattle, pigs, or fish. The bones are crushed into a thin powder and then mixed with hot water, which causes hydrolysis to occur and allows the gelatin to be extracted. The extract then congeals after the mixture is cooled. Gelatin that is produced from kosher animals that have been slaughtered properly is certainly kosher. But the majority of gelatin used today comes from non-kosher animals, e.g. pigs or cattle, that have not been slaughtered properly and therefore have the status of nevela. It is the halachic status of this type of gelatin that poskim of recent generations have disputed as to whether it may be used or not. Now I'm going to stop there for a second so you heard me correctly. We're talking about animals which haven't had proper slaughtering, so it's called nevela or terefa. It's not kosher, it's non-kosher animals, or it's pigs, it's non-kosher animals completely. Forget the slaughter, it's non-kosher. So you might be thinking to yourselves, why is this even a discussion? If it's non-kosher meat, it's non-kosher meat, how can it possibly be kosher? Rabbi, why are we having a class on gelatin? It's not kosher. And the only thing which could be kosher would be fish. And if it's kosher animal meat which has been slaughtered correctly, then it should be meat. It should be carne, it should be basari. And how could I possibly have that with dairy candies? So let's get into this and try and understand what exactly is going on. So before that, I can see there's something in the chat there. So, Jonathan, you're bang on. John writes in the chat there, isn't it something inedible because it's been turned into something else? It's exactly what the Ramah is going to talk about. Rav Moshe Isserles, again, for those who don't know the Ramah was an Ashkenazic rabbi in Krakow in the 16th century, early 17th century. He wrote his glosses on the Shulchan Aruch. And he writes a very important ruling, which is very applicable to this topic. He says, or hakeva, the lining of a stomach, lipamim mulachim oto umeyavshin oto. It's sometimes salted and dried out. V'na'aseh ke'etz, and it can be made to become like wood. Umemal'im oto chalav, and then it can be filled up with milk in order to make cheese. Umutar, and this is permissible. The ma'achash nityavesh have a ke'etz ba'alma, because once it has become dried out, it is considered like wood. Ve'en bo lachluchit basar, it has no moisture of meat in it. This teaching about how you make cheese is the basis for possibly why we would allow the gelatin. The Shach writes, or hakeva lefamim, v'u'adin sha b'nei ma'ayim. This is true not only for the stomach lining, but also for any of the intestines. K'shemeyav shimotan, when you dry them out, ad shena'asu ka'etz, until they become like wood. Mikol makom nira, nevertheless it seems, the lachatchila ein la'asot ken. Ideally, one should not do this. So again, you might be asking, Rabbi, what are we talking about here? If the Shach, the Siftei Kohen, a super commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, says, ideally we shouldn't do this. And it's straightforward. It's not something ideal. And therefore, whether it's the normal form of the meat or not, whether it's been dried out to wood or not, we don't do this lechatchila. So what are we talking about? So let's have a look here. Based on this, we might think that gelatin should be permitted, since it is dried out, when extracted from the bones or skin and is no longer considered edible. But as I said, the Shach says one shouldn't do this lechatchila, we should be strict. Nevertheless, one of the first poskim to discuss this is Rav Chaim Ozer Grodzinski in his famous responsa called Achiezer. That even the Shach would agree that the gelatin is very different to what the Ramah is talking about, because gelatin has been completely dried out chemically after being extracted from the bones, and therefore the Shach stringency only applies to the rest of the stomach, which still retains some moisture, but not in the case of the bones. And he writes, concerning whether it's possible to certify as kosher a new type of powder whose origin is from dry bones and is mixed with many types of foods and also used to stabilize various types. But it seems that in this case, where its form is totally lost, it is more lenient. And also, even according to the Shach, that the same is true for the rest of the intestines that become like wood when they are dried out, that lechatchila, ideally, one should not do so. It seems that is all referring to the intestines, but not to the bones. And even according to those who argue with the Ramah there, that the bones do not permit it, it's because they hold that there is moisture present. But it seems that where they have been dried out and there is no moisture left, it is considered dry bones, and all would agree. Okay, so according to the Achiezer, okay, Rav Grodzinski, drying out chemically of the bones into a powder made into gelatin, this isn't just something which the Ramah might say, okay, and the Shach says b'diavad, for making rennet, for making cheese. That's not what it's talking about. It's talking about lechatchila, gelatin should be fine for everyone. Indeed, Hacham Ovadia Yosef rules like this, like the position of the Achiezer, and says that when this chemical change in the form that into gelatin undergoes, it should be permitted. Okay, Hacham Ovadia Yosef, the #1 Sephardic posek in Israel who passed away in 2013. He writes, the basis for permission in this case is the Ramah in Yored De'ah that we just saw. And it's also even quoted by Rav Yosef Karo in the Bet Yosef. And he writes, it would seem that an additional factor for leniency can be added in our case, that since during the process of producing the gelatin from the skin and the bones, after they have been dried out well in the sun for a number of months, they mix them with chemical salts and grind them up very well so that it all becomes a thin powder, and it is considered a new entity, what's known in halacha as panim chadashot. Don't think of panim chadashot as just something you need 2 new faces during Sheva Brachot at a wedding. Panim chadashot is a halachic term for something which is a new concept or a new entity with the ingredients inside. And this is also the opinion of my friend, Hagaon, Rav Eliezer Yehuda Waldenberg, okay, the Tzitz Eliezer, in a comment on the responsum of Rabbi Cheskel Abramsky, and he relies on the responsum of the Achiezer, and this is the accepted approach concerning the practical halacha. Okay, so we're now going to see that we're saying now 2 contemporary poskim of the late 20th century, Hacham Ovadia Yosef and the Tzitz Eliezer, Rav Waldenberg, is that I can lechatchila use gelatin because, as John put in the chat there, it's been changed completely. It's panim chadashot, and therefore, even though it was originally non-kosher meat, even pig meat, because it's been completely and utterly changed, it can be used. It's not considered food. So if that was the case, friends, you just tell me, well, gelatin shouldn't be a controversial matter. It should be ubiquitous. All hechsherim should use it. What's the problem? Well, before we get into what's the problem, I do want to explain to you. Now, some of you asked me, why is it that some hechsherim are not recommended or are not promoted as the gold standard? One of the reasons is because of this. Some hechsherim in America give hechshers to gelatin which doesn't have fish or kosher animals which have been slaughtered correctly sources for their gelatin, and therefore they rely on this Achiezer, they rely on Hacham Ovadia Yosef's ruling and the Tzitz Eliezer's ruling, but because it's not mainstream, we say it's not a regular hechsher. And as I'm saying, sometimes you have the situation where some people say, well, that's not a normative halachic position. You're right, this isn't a accepted position by mainstream kashrut organizations. But as we just said, Hacham Ovadia Yosef is no lightweight when it comes to making halachic rulings. So understand, for Sfaradim, at least, it seems to be huge weight to rely on to have such a hechsher. And even for Ashkenazim, the Tzitz Eliezer is one of the top acharonim to rely on in the late 20th century, early 21st century. But we're going to come back to it. But I just want you to understand that, again, it's not mainstream, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't have halachic boots, where one can certainly walk in them and rely on them. So let's have a look more and try and understand what is the problem then with gelatin if we've just seen that all these other rabbis, the Hacham Ovadia Yosef and the Tzitz Eliezer have permitted it. So one of those who doesn't like it is Rabbi Cheskel Abramsky, a Dayan in London. And he rejects the position of Hacham Ovadia Yosef. He writes, it is clear that gelatin is made of bones, and it's not, for him, a new creation. By the way, have a look at how you spell gelatin in Yiddish. It's one of my favorites. Gelatin is Daled Zayin Shin. Gelatin. I'm just a lover of Yiddish spellings of words. So gelatin. So it is clear that the gelatin that is made of bones is not, in his eyes, a panim chadashot or a yitzira chadasha, a new creation that was transformed from one material to a new material through chemical change. This is because gelatin is the same fundamental substance that exists in the bones, and all of the chemical means used in the production of gelatin only come to separate the other substances present in bones from the gelatin, so they do not ruin it or detract from its quality. Accordingly, there is no room for a discussion concerning the permissibility of gelatin made from the bones of nebelot and treifot, based on the words of Rabbeinu Yonah. So what he's saying is, who are the rabbis who permit it? The rabbis who permit it is because they consider gelatin to be something new. It's a new creation. It's nothing like what it was before. Who are the rabbis who say you can't have it? Those who say there hasn't really been a strong enough chemical change, and so therefore it's the same thing. I'm just reading the notes John's adding in the chat here. I saw a site once that claimed their beef-derived gelatin was parve, since they used a process that verifiably burnt off all of the edible parts of the animal and left only the skin and bones. Ergo, it started off as something edible. This seems like a slightly different argument. Is that the case, or is it still going to be converted, dried, and then rely on the same rulings? So I think this is basically you're coming to the crux of it, John, which is what exactly are the rabbis arguing about? Is it a chemical process? I think that's exactly they're saying that is the chemical process, that it's being dried out and all that's being left is the skin and bones. Are these skin and bones a panim chadashot, a yetzira chadasha, a new formation, or are they scrape it all back? It's still only skin and bones, but it's still animal matter nonetheless. I think that's where we're going with it. Abramsky continues, and he writes, regarding the halacha, my opinion leads towards those who permit, due to the reason the bones are not included in nevela and treifa, concerning the matter of prohibition. As in he's saying, although this is true as halacha, it does not seem to be forbidden. Practically, one must consider whether this will not cause people to stumble, as people will err and cause others to err by saying that the rules of the Torah change according to the whim of the rabbis and halachic authorities within the Jewish people. So what's he saying? Technically speaking, me'ikar hadin, you are right. This is no longer, in a halachic sense, considered non-kosher meat because it's been dried out and chemically changed to the point where it's like dried wood. However, if I tell you that non-kosher animals, which haven't been slaughtered kosher, is now running around with a hechsher, Jerry Adato is going to tell me, what are you talking about, Rabbi? Because it was the first thing I asked you this morning. Gelatin, you said, how could gelatin be permitted? You're eating non-kosher meat, because that's the normal response. So Rav Abramsky's position is not that it's a halachic reason to permit it or forbid it. The reason to say it's asur, to forbid it, is if you say yes, it's going to cause people to be incredulous. How could you possibly say that's allowed? If that's allowed, then what isn't allowed? He continues to write, because the essence of gelatin was not known and there was a lack of knowledge about the matter it was made, it was accepted until now by everyone as prohibited, since it was known to everyone that it came from non-kosher nevelot and treifot. And so therefore, if everyone knew that it was forbidden, and I now come, Rabbi Hassan, I come in my Zoom class and say, no problem, everyone go and eat gelatin. They're like, what are you talking about? Are you an Orthodox rabbi? Are you a Sephardic community leader? How can you say this is permitted? What do you mean you're quoting Hacham Avadia Yosef? We know where it comes from. How can you permit that? Our parents didn't eat it. Our grandparents didn't eat it. How are you to do so? And that's basically his argument, that if you allow this, you're going to cause the whole halachic system to go into disrepute. Okay? There's another argument about this, and that's the Minchat Yitzchak. And he says, no, nothing to do with that. Rather, he thinks itself that it is non-kosher. He says, a short time ago, an expert and well-known chemist in England, by the way, if you like my Yiddish spellings of England, it's not Anglia, it's England with an I in there, England. A short time ago, an expert and well-known chemist in England invented a new invention where gelatin is produced from pieces of refuse and remnants of animal skins that have already been processed in tanneries for making shoes, suitcases, and other leather items. And the question is whether one can distinguish halachically between gelatin produced from pieces of skin after they have been processed in the tannery and those made from bones or simple skins that are not processed, which have already been decided as forbidden according to the majority of great Torah authorities. And I have received a number of pamphlets from major poskim, some who forbid and some who permit, and they asked me to express my opinion. Uv'da'ati ha'aniyah, my humble opinion, maskemet im ha'asurim, I agree with those who forbid, ein lahatir b'nidon didan. We cannot permit it in this case. And by the way, as I've told you many times, whenever you have something which says, in my humble opinion, or v'da'ati ha'aniyah, another way of saying my humble opinion, he's not being humble, he's saying that is exactly the position. In footnote 40, it says there, the Minchat Yitzchak then elaborates in great length in the rest of the Teshuvah to prove that it should be forbidden. He focuses mainly on the issues of whether bones have a forbidden status or not, and argues that they do, as well as on the issue of the changed form, about which he argues that it is still subject to a major machloket, and therefore one should be strict. Rav Moshe Feinstein also forbids the use of gelatin made from forbidden animals within foods, and again, using that beautiful spelling of gelatin, gelatin should be forbidden. Why? Since there is still a prohibition involved in consuming the skins and bones and the like, even though one is exempt, as the Rambam wrote in Machlot Asarat, and even though it is forbidden, one is exempt from punishment, and therefore Mimela Asur Gam HaGelatin Mahem. Therefore, gelatin that comes from them is forbidden. Rav Moshe here focuses on the question of whether bones and skin have the status of non-kosher meat, and Rav Moshe, based on the Rambam, says they do, not on a D'Oraitan, a Torah level, but at least on a rabbinic D'Rabanan level. Rav Aaron Kotler, founding Rosh Hashiva of the Bet Midrash Gavoa in Lakewood, also forbids gelatin and responds to the argument for leniency offered by Rav Grudzinski in the Achiezer, that the bones are totally dried out and are no longer considered edible food. Rav Kotler explains at length that many sources indicate that if the non-kosher substance is then reconstituted into an edible form, it would be forbidden. In addition, he also argues in the excerpt below that gelatin should be forbidden regardless because it is like seor, which is forbidden on Pesach because it causes other foods to rise. So too, the gelatin helps to maintain the form of the rest of the food in which it is placed, and therefore one should not be lenient in any way, shape, or form. Pun intended there. I hope you got my pun. That's my wife, because I never do puns. Rav Chaim Jachter summarizes 4 basic approaches to gelatin. Number 1, it's always permitted. That would be the Achiezer and Hacham Avadia Yosef and the Tzitz Eliezer. Number 2, it is permitted when manufactured from hard bones. That is the approach of Rav Grudzinski as well as Rav Henkin. You can see those in the footnotes. It's forbidden because of doubt. That's Rabbi Abramsky. And then the last one, it's forbidden because of certainty, and that would be the position of Rav Kotler as well as the Minchat Yitzchak. Okay? Rav Zusha Blech reports that the current practice of most reputable kashrut organizations in the diaspora today is not to rely on the leniencies for gelatin and only to accept gelatin made out of fish or gelatin that is certified kosher, i.e. made from kosher animals, okay? And so therefore, in his article, Would These Bones Live, playing on the, as a play on words on the Haftarah that we read on Pesach, Chol HaMoed, of the dry bones coming back to life, the modern story of kosher gelatin production in the United States begins about 40 years ago, when a famous chocolate company in the United States wanted to produce kosher marshmallows. The issue of gelatin has always been controversial. So Rav Nachum Tzvi Kornmel, the Rav HaMachshir of the company, posed the question to 3 of the prominent halachic authorities in the United States, Rav Moshe, Rav Aaron Kotler, and Rav Henkin, and to the Gedolim in Israel. Although differing in some of the details in their rulings, the consensus of these authorities was that regular gelatin could not be accepted as kosher, and their position became the normative kosher standard in North America. Indeed, all of the major kosher certifying agents in the United States adhere to the rulings of Rav Feinstein, Rav Kotler, and Rav Henkin, and do not certify products containing such gelatin. According to the Kosharot organizations based in Israel, the current practice of the Israeli rabbinate is also not to allow non-kosher-based gelatin in products marked in Israel. However, they note that many kashrut organizations outside of Israel may indeed rely on the leniencies in certifying gummies, candy bars, and the like with questionable sources of gelatin. Okay? And he writes that there. So, if we stop here, and there Rav Jachta says when it comes to taking gelatin gel caps for medications, since it's for medication, even if it's just mechush ba'alma, there are those who permit it because it's someone who is not feeling well. So therefore, gel caps would be okay. So what we've seen so far is a situation where we began with the Achiezer and Hacham Avaji Yosef and the Tzitz Eliezer saying, this is a great ingenuity, it's Panim Chadashot, it's Yetzirah Chadasha, it's a new formation, and so therefore it doesn't have the halachic status of non-kosher meat, and therefore can be used, has suddenly changed to a form of, no, one shouldn't do it because people will begin to question, since it used to be always forbidden, to people saying, no, it's out and out non-kosher, and one shouldn't do it at all and not rely on this leniency. So as I said at the beginning, the normal position for most kashrut agencies in Israel and in America is not to give a hechsher to meat of this non-kosher source. However, there are kashrut agencies, the ones which we say are not recommended. One of the reasons why they're not recommended is because they use this leniency. What I wanted to share with you tonight is not everyone should be running out and eating those hechshers, but to understand that those hechshers have what to rely on. It's not necessarily that those hechshers are completely crazy where their position has no position in halakha. It has a position in halakha, but it was rejected by the main poskim of North America and also in Israel. Are there any questions about gelatin? Okay, if there are no questions, I'd like to continue the discussion now and move on into a discussion about whiskey. Okay, now this is a question which has changed, and we're going to talk about it, has changed because the nature of making whiskey has changed. Whereas in the past, whiskey may have had sherry casks, but that wasn't the point of how the whiskey was made. Now, the whiskey makers go out of their way to promote the sherry casks. If so, how can we be able to permit whiskey which is made where the maturing of the whiskey is done with ingredients which were non-kosher? So we're going to have a look at this. And we're going to have a little bit of a background to how whiskey is made. All right? And it starts as follows. This is an article by Rav Jonathan Gilbert. Is whiskey kosher? It's been a long time since the McVeigh family took Abu Musa Jabir ibn Hayyan's secrets of distillation and converted them into the first bottles of whiskey some 1,200 years ago. Originally used as an internal anesthetic and an external antibiotic, whiskey has become the most popular liquor in the world. But such popularity could not be free of controversy. Ireland and Scotland both claim to have given birth to whiskey, and you can have a look at that. The whiskey ring, a bribing scheme involving hundreds of whiskey distillers and government officials, was among the muddiest chapters in 19th century American politics. There was even a machloket concerning, and he's joking here, the spelling of the word. The Scots spell it whiskey without an E and the Irish with an E. For us Torah Jews, the controversy has a different name, and that is sherry casks. The process of making whiskey is quite straightforward. The grains are crushed, water is added, the mixture is boiled, and yeast is added for fermentation. By now, we basically have beer. Then it is distilled and aged in wooden barrels. Although easier said than done, at least it poses no real halachic problems, except for the last stage, the aging in the barrels. Is in his extraordinary booklet, Rabbi Akiva Nyhaus suggests that whiskey was originally aged in any type of barrel, preferably a used one, so the sharp tannins found in the woods would not ruin the delicate flavor of the scotch. Sherry wine casks were abundantly available simply because Spanish producers would send their wine in barrels to England to be bottled. This continued until the 70s, when sherry producers began bottling their wine and casks were no longer found in abundance in the UK. So whiskey producers began American bourbon casks instead. So they brought American bourbon casks instead, but consumers were not happy. Something in their drink did not taste the same. Now they had to go out of their way to get those old sherry casks, going as far as filling new barrels with sherry just to mature the whiskey later on. This is, of course, presents the halachic problem, which we're going to explore. The Gemara in Avodah Zarah explains that any wine owned or produced by non-Jews may not be consumed by rabbinic law. We learned this because either it may lead to intermarriage or eventually to idolatry. Okay? Some sources identify this decree dating back to the time of the Jewish people in the desert when Pinchas, following the shameful affair with the daughters of Midian, forbade any consumption of non-Jewish wine. Sherry wine, a pungent variety from the Spanish region of Jerez, is certainly considered stam yenam and is therefore forbidden by halakha. So what is the status of other drinks which are mixed with it? May they be annulled? And if so, at what ratio? And we're going to get into the more problematic part of, if you can annul it, are you allowed to annul it when it's being added for flavor? But let's get into this. The Gemara relates an incident where Ravina allowed his son, Rav Chia, to store beer in a barrel previously used for non-kosher wine. Accordingly, the Shulchan Aruch codifies that vessels prohibited by non-Jewish wine may be used for storing water, beer, and other liquids in them as long as they were rinsed beforehand. The reason explains the Taz is because the flavor of wine ruins the other liquids, what's known as noten tam nifgam, which we've talked about many times. Therefore, even if the liquids were stored for more than 24 hours in the barrel, they may still be consumed. If so, why is there even a question? Is not whiskey among the other liquids permitted by the Shulchan Aruch? Clearly not. Whiskey distillers make a big fuss about the sherry cask aging. They even take an extra expense to do so, and consumers are willing to pay the extra price for the enhanced flavor. What are we saying here? It's not, by the way, it happens to be the whiskey that's how it's made. That's the marketing. I've got my favorite sherry cask whiskey. It's better than regular aged whiskey, although there is little consensus on how it's achieved. So although there's little consensus on how that is achieved, it's clearly not just the wine. Otherwise, wouldn't it be easier and cheaper just to add a small proportion of wine into the whiskey? In any event, halakhic authorities understand that we cannot rely on this position of noten tam nifgam, or leniency, where the mixture is enhanced. This idea is expressed clearly by Magen Avraham on the laws of Pesach. Similarly, we cannot rely on the fact that wine absorbed in the casks is most certainly not ben yomah when the whiskey is poured. Just as the Rama explains, wine does not become pagum, it doesn't become a negative taste even after 24 hours. In fact, says the Shach, instead of getting ruined, the flavor of wine actually improves with time. Therefore, the question is, can the good taste of the wine imparted into the whiskey even be nullified? After all, there is a rabbinic prohibition to annul forbidden mixtures lechatchila. Can I do this? The Shulchan Aruch says that if a person does so knowingly, b'mezid, the food becomes forbidden to him and to the person for which the nullification was intended. That's a whole siman in Yoredea, siman tzaditet 99. Even more so, Rabbi Akiva Eiger quotes opinions that hold that even when a seller nullifies the forbidden taste for unknown consumers, it is prohibited to them. However, poskim were lenient with the nullification we made for a majority of non-Jewish consumers, as is the case of any whiskey distillery. So perhaps I could say, you know what, if it was only for Jews, then I've got a problem. But since the majority of whiskey production is for non-Jews, then perhaps we can allow it. If so, what's the amount of wine that must be annulled and at what ratio? This is another dispute among the poskim on how much wine is absorbed into the cask. In Siman 135, the Shulchan Aruch states that a vessel filled with forbidden wine absorbs only kedei kelipa, a thin layer, and therefore may be kashered by peeling off that layer. The Taz assumes that this is the halacha even if the wine was in the vessel for a long period of time. However, the Shach is of the opinion that you want the kevisha, soaking a liquid in a vessel for 24 hours, is just like cooking and therefore gives off its taste not to the thin layer but to the entire vessel. Since it's impossible to know how much taste is actually absorbed, the halacha assumes the worst case scenario, meaning the entire vessel is filled with the taste. There does not seem to be clear-cut agreement on who to follow. Some follow like the Taz, just the Kalipa, while others hold like the Shach, and being the whole vessel. Regarding the ratio required to annul the absorbed wine, the Torah quotes a dispute among the Rishonim. Some of them assume that it's like any other forbidden taste, which requires 60 times the volume of permitted food to become nullified, while a second opinion suggests it may be annulled in just 6 times its volume. The source of the lenient opinion is the understanding of the Ra'avad and the Ri of Rabbi Yochanan's ruling in the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, that if one had 2 cups of wine, one non-sacred and one of terumah, and then he diluted them with water and mixed them together, one should consider the permitted non-sacred wine as non-existent, and the terumah wine as then nullified by the water. Since the Gemara does not specify the size of the cups nor the amount of water added, the Ra'avad and the Ri assume they are 2 equally sized cups, diluted by 3 parts of water each, as was the practice in Talmudic times. Given the halacha of considering the permitted non-sacred wine as non-existent in matters of nullification, it can be inferred that there is 1 part of wine against 6. So instead of saying it's 1 in 60, we only have to rely on 1 in 6. And this is the position of the Shulchan Aruch. Why is wine different from any other beverage that should be annulled in just 6 parts as opposed to 60? The Rashba explains that when mixed with 6 parts of water, it's no longer considered wine. Rather, it becomes some acid beverage called kiua, which imparts a ruined flavor. So do we apply that to whiskey? Do we say the whiskey is like water? It's not clear, though, whether this ratio of nullifying wine in a mixture of 1 to 6 is something particular to wine mixed with water, according to these opinions, or would it apply as well to wine mixed with other liquids? Once again, this is another machloket between the Taz and the Shach. The Ramah prohibits buying beverages from the non-Jews when it may be assumed that wine was mixed into them in a ratio of more than 1 in 60. The Shach consequently infers that wine can only be nullified in water in a ratio of 1 to 6, but in other liquids, it must be 1 to 60. The Taz, however, believes that the Ramah is simply quoting the source of the ruling, but the Ramah himself requires only a ratio of 1 in 6, just like the Shulchan Aruch. Later poskim seem to agree with the Taz and suggest that the wine in the casks, even if it does impart taste, is considered kiua. This seems to be an integral part of the argument, and Rav Moshe Feinstein and Rav Yitzchak Weiss to permit whiskey, and they did so in the 50s. Accordingly, we can assume that the flavor of the wine can be annulled in the casks if we can ascertain that there is 6-to-1 ratio present. Another potential issue, in case you weren't enough, concerning sherry casks is the ruling of the Shulchan Aruch that imposes a limit to nullification on ingredients when they give flavor, what's known as avida leta'ama, as long as their taste is perceived. This issue, however, can be deflected either by arguing that once it becomes ki'ua, it no longer enhances the taste, or by saying that even whiskey producers are not really interested in the flavor of wine, even when they actually say they are, hence sherry cask whiskey. Rav Weiss suggests that the main purpose of adding the wine is reducing the negative impact of the wood on the liquor. Remember, that was the whole reason why they went for sherry cask, because it stopped the tannins in the wood from damaging the whiskey. Here too, it seems obvious that even when the sherry affects the whiskey, it does so in an indirect manner, which could not be accomplished by just adding wine. Okay, because again, we're looking for the sherry to protect the wood, so the wood doesn't then damage the whiskey. If I just add non-kosher wine or even kosher wine to the whiskey, the wood is going to still hurt the whiskey in the long term. Consequently, our main question remains, are there 6 parts of whiskey against the amounts of absorbed wine? Rabbi Nyhaus estimates a ratio of 3.76 to 1, which is less than 6 to 1, if we consider the whole volume of a standard wooden sherry cask. Although he does not address this point, it is obvious there is much more than 6 to 1 if we were to follow the opinion of the Taz, that considers only the kelipa, the outer layer of the cask, was being absorbed with the wine. Besides the issues mentioned here, many other issues that are beyond the scope of this article must also be considered in determining the halachic status of whiskey in sherry casks. How many times was the cask filled with whiskey? What about casks that mix sherry and bourbon? What is the halacha for blended whiskeys that were only partly matured in sherry casks? When can a person rely on the information given by this distillery or printed on the bottle? And what does he conclude? The safest thing to do is to only buy whiskey which has a kosher hechsher. Now, I was enjoying him until he got to that last point, which was the only whiskey you can buy is if it carries an OU. Now, I think there's a happy medium there, which is you don't need to buy a hechshered whiskey. But if you want to remove yourself from doubt, then don't buy sherry cask whiskey. If you are someone who likes sherry cask whiskey, and again, I am quite partial to sherry cask whiskey, then you have many things with which to rely on. And primarily understanding that, which is that the whiskey that we're drinking here is not being enhanced by the sherry into the whiskey. It's the reaction of the sherry into the wood barrels. That's what's going on. And if you like the sherry cask into the wooden barrels, then all I need to do to make sure is that it's 6 to 1. Now, if you're worried about, is it the entire volume of the barrel or is it just the surface area? Yes, again, I don't think there's anything wrong with saying I'm just going to rely on the outer surface area, and therefore there's definitely more than 6 to 1, and you can have the sherry cask whiskey. Okay, so at SBH, what has been the policy? We have allowed sherry cask whiskey until COVID hit because we relied on these lenient positions. If someone wants to be strict and only buy non-sherry cask whiskey, absolutely. If someone wants to be even more stringent and only buy kosher whiskey with a hechsher, I would say that's a very good thing, provided that you realize that the hechsher is not required. If you think that the hechsher is required, then we're losing something, because this is something which our parents and our grandparents have always done, and has been a long-standing tradition in our community from the time that Rabbi Maimon went to give a hechsher to Crown Royal all those years ago in the 1940s, or even earlier. So we should always realize that sometimes the koach dehetera, the power to permit, is much better than the koach le'isura, the power to prohibit. And we should always, when possible, allow something rather than look to limit the scope. Because when we limit, then unfortunately, we make an even more narrow and narrower escape for things to be. So if you're asking me, Rabbi, which one should I do? Should I be eating gummies with questionable hechshers, or should I be drinking sherry cask whiskey? there's probably more religious Jews drinking sherry cask whiskey than they are having questionable gelatin. But ironically, the gelatin might be a more halachically sound argument than the sherry cask whiskey. Now, all jokes aside, I think if you're going to be careful about gelatin, you should be careful about sherry cask whiskey. And a normal position, if you can get the kosher gummies in Israel, which are fish-based or kosher animal-based, they are parav because the meat has been completely degenerated. I know that was a question in the chat. And so therefore, that's the way to go. For other people, I have been known to give a psak halacha to allow certain people to rely on more lenient hechsherim for private use, not for community use. Especially for pressing circumstances. But with the whiskey, as I said, I think there's what to rely on, but it doesn't hurt if someone wants to be strict, but one should know that a hechsher, at least in my opinion, I don't think is necessary.